Welcome back to the Fast Lane, this special edition of the Fast Lane. And ironically, you don't hear Ed's voice because this is Trey Lyle doing a unique new kind of segment to the Fast Lane, a bonus episode to the podcast feed. We're going to preview a couple of games during the college football season for your local teams each week. But first, we're starting with season previews, and we're going to start with the team in Charlottesville, Virginia, the University of Virginia Cavaliers. And I'm joined by Damon Dillman from CavsCorner.com. Damon, how are you doing today?
I'm all right, Trey. How are you?
I am doing pretty well. Thank you so much for joining me. And it's going to be a very interesting season for the University of Virginia in a crazy Coastal Division where, anything is possible is what I've learned from the Coastal Division, even though there's probably two heavy favorites and the two best teams in the Coastal in a very long time in terms of depth.
Yeah, it's like you said, there's always something unexpected in the Coastal. And I think there are a lot of teams, those two teams at the top, like you mentioned, Carolina and Miami are both going to be pretty good teams. But who knows? Weird things happen. Weird things have happened over the years here in the Coastal. And there are a lot of teams that have a lot of experience back because of the way things have gone these last few years because of COVID. And so strange things happen on Saturdays, especially in the Coastal. So I think there are those two teams at the top that you point to, but there's a lot of depth to the league this year. UVA being one of those teams in the mix, Tech being one of those teams in the mix. I like Narduzzi at Pitt. I think he's a really good coach. And so I can never rule them out as well. And so I think it's a deep division, and it'll be really interesting to see how it all kind of shakes out over the course of this fall.
You can never not be entertained by Coastal chaos. That's what I always say. So, give the ACC some flack, but they still have, a top tier team. And then they have one of the most interesting divisions in all of college football. Let's jump right in. And you talked about experience, a lot of experience coming back from the University of Virginia, including on the offense. And, maybe in the two most important positions, the offensive line and the quarterback, starting with the quarterback, Brennan Armstrong, he had to fill huge shoes by Bryce Perkins, who was the best player that UVA's had in a very long time. And he did pretty well last year, given all the circumstances, over 2,000 yards, 18 touchdowns, led the team in rushing as well, turnovers being the big issue for him. What are your expectations for Brennan as he heads into, this second full season as a starter?
Yeah, by all accounts, he has taken all those things that he learned in his first year as the starter last year and kind of built off of those experiences now going into year two as the starter. So like you mentioned, he averaged 2 touchdowns a game through the air. He was the team's leading rusher. The turnovers, like you mentioned, were the big thing for him last year. He's talked a lot, and everybody at UVA has talked a lot about how he needs to cut back on those turnovers. And Armstrong himself has said that he spent a lot of time this offseason. The primary thing he worked on was in not so much, he feels like he's pretty comfortable, pretty confident in this UVA offense. So what he focused on was what our opposing defense is trying to throw at him, and how do you read before the snap, the way teams are lining up, maybe what kind of audibles you can go into, just pre-snap reads, and just doing a better job of being more decisive with his decisions, being faster with those decisions, being more comfortable with checkdowns when they're there, when they have to be there, because the opposing defense is taking away what he's hoping to do, that primary shot. He feels like he's doing a better job of not necessarily trying to force the ball and checking down to those other options. So yeah, the big question with him is, he's saying the right thing right now, but will he do the right thing once things get going here, once August turns into September? So yeah, if he can cut down on those turnovers and be a more efficient quarterback and kind of build on what he was able to do both as a passer and as a runner last year, I think the history of UVA quarterbacks putting up monster numbers isn't a very long one. So he has an opportunity here, if he can kind of build on what he did last year, to keep climbing up the school record books and maybe going down as, at least statistically, one of the best quarterbacks in program history. But like you kind of alluded to, it all starts with being better with the football, being more efficient and smarter with the football, and cutting back on some of those turnovers. Especially a lot of them came late in games, or when UVA was down by a couple of touchdowns and he was trying to be maybe a hero a little bit too much and trying to lead them back into some of those games that they were trailing, like the Tech game at the end of the year, for example, or the NC State game when he got hurt. So yeah, if they can do a better job of getting out the leads and being more efficient with the football, I think Armstrong could be poised to have a really big year in this offense.
What are your expectations? I know you kind of touched on it when you over it. Do you expect the turnovers to be down and him have, I don't want to say an all ACC caliber year, but obviously with the talented quarterback in this conference is really deep all around. But,
Yeah.
In that range of the Phil Jacobitz, the Sam Howells, the DJ Ukuleles, I think that's how you pronounce his name, of the world.
Yeah. All ACC is obviously a high bar this year because of those guys that you just rattled off. There's a lot of competition, but I think it goes beyond all ACC, and it's just a matter of being more efficient, like I talked about before. And I do think there's nothing as valuable as experience from that quarterback position. He played a little bit behind Bryce Perkins those first couple of years, saw some reps with the first team offense. There'd be a couple of series where Perkins would get banged up and be out for a series or two, and then Armstrong, he would do a good job in those. I remember when he was a true freshman against Louisville, breaking off a big run in that game here that led to a field goal in a game UVA won at Georgia Tech. He threw a touchdown pass. Joe Reed made a good throw on third down to Joe Reed, who then broke it for a long touchdown. So he did a good job in those early opportunities. And last year was his first real chance to be the guy. And he learned from it. He got hurt against NC State, and he was even better. If you look at the numbers, he was better in terms of throwing fewer turnovers, throwing fewer interceptions those last 5 or so games after he came back from that concussion, until, like I mentioned earlier, the game in Blacksburg where he threw a couple of picks, trying to be a hero, trying to lead them back. So I think he learned from those experiences and he put in the work this summer. And I really believe that as long as they do a better job as an offense of getting on the board early, staying out of those early holes and not having to do too much through the passing game to get back into games, I think there's a real opportunity there for him to improve on those numbers. And because we saw under Bryce Perkins, if this offense is a little more efficient, throws fewer turnovers, what it can do. And so I think that's kind of the expectation for Armstrong now is to kind of get that completion percentage up, get those interceptions down, and that leads to more points on the board and more time of possession and more wins, quite frankly.
Under 60% is probably the best bar to think about. If Armstrong was under that last season, probably wants to get over that as we head next season. And, for a quarterback, having your offensive line completely back is probably going to help that a lot. This was a solid offensive line. I think there are a couple better units overall, but this was a unit that honestly, surprisingly to me, when I was doing research, allowed the fewest tackles for loss in the ACC. So it showed the ability to block. I just think, they need to improve their blocking a lot. Obviously, the run game kind of suffered last season. And if you want to be more efficient, you have to be more physical. Just talk about their offensive line and how key is it to have all 5 starters back and how that could help this UVA offense, which might have to carry the team a little bit like it did last year.
Yeah, I think you touched on it with all the guys. And it's not just that these guys are back, but these are guys who've been in this program for a long time who are back. Chris Glazer at right guard, he's one of those so-called super seniors, a guy who under normal circumstances would have exhausted his eligibility, but he's back this year because of the extra bonus COVID year. But all 5, the guys who ended the year last year as the starting 5 along that offensive line, all 5 of them are back. And I think all of them, except for Bissinger at left guard, are seniors this year, 5th-year seniors who've been in this program for quite some time now. You got Ryan Nelson at left tackle, who he redshirted his first year, and ever since he started every game the past 3 years. At left guard is Bissinger, who kind of slid into that starting role last year, but he's held on to it now going into the William and Mary game. Oluwatimi at center, he's a guy that they love in this program. He's been the starting center these last few years. Glazer at right guard, and then Swoboda at right tackle, who took over last year and did a good job at that spot last year. And then Bobby Haskins is back. Bobby Haskins is a guy who was the starting left tackle 2 years ago on the Coastal Division title team when they had Nelson at left guard and Haskins at left tackle. Haskins played last year, but he wasn't himself because of a bad back. He had some back issues he was coming back from. He's back this year, and he hasn't been able to crack that starting 5. He's kind of the swing tackle right now in camp going into the season. So I think that's a lot. These are guys who've played a lot of games together for the most part. And they've been a part of some pretty good teams. They were part of that Coastal Division team 2 years ago. They were on this team last year that was pretty prolific offensively. And you had talked about some of statistically the way they played. There are signs there that there is a potential there to be a really solid offensive line. Since Bronco has gotten here and 2J, the offensive line coach, since they got here 5 years ago, that's always been the thing they pointed to was we need to rebuild the offensive line. Well, Now it's rebuilt. Now these are guys who are in their fifth year in this program under this coaching staff, and these guys need to show that they can be the guys who lead the way, so to speak. That's kind of their catchphrase. The guys up front lead the way. This is their opportunity to show that they can do that, and if they can, then that makes life a lot easier for Armstrong. It makes life a lot easier for Talapapa or whoever else might be getting the carries at running back, as they've talked about wanting to establish that traditional so-called running game more this year. So that all starts up front and with those guys who've been in this program for a long time. And this is their opportunity to lead the way, like they like to proclaim.
I don't want to call it the weakest because I think this is a really solid offense all around. But I think in terms of just experience and the loss of talent or production from last season, their skill positions is where you need to expect the most step up. Obviously, Talapapa coming back is huge for them. The incoming Indiana transfer, Ronnie Walker, kind of, that two-headed monster. I think UVA is feeling at running back. How do you feel about that position? It's a place where they need more production, obviously, from last season. How does they feel about talking to the coaching staff? How do they feel about the running back position heading into this season?
Yeah, I think it starts with Talapapa. And I think by this point, he's another guy who's been in this program for a long time. He's a senior this year, and they know what they have in Talapapa at this point. He's in third and short or down around the goal line. He's a guy who can grind out and get those short yards or get into the end zone. We've seen it from him a lot. I forget what the percentage is, but more than half of his touchdowns, career touchdowns, are from inside the 5, inside the 10. He's not necessarily a guy, however, who's going to break some big runs. And that's something that this offense has lacked over the last few years. I think his career long is 31 and his career 31 yards and his longest touchdown is 19. So he's not a threat necessarily to be a big play guy. And some of that may again go back to the offensive line, like we talked about, and the holes that they're opening up. But I think the guy to keep an eye out for in competition is Mike Hollins, who is back with this program now. He played a little bit as a true freshman in 2019. And then he opted out last year. And I know going back 2 years ago when he was a true freshman, he was a guy who the coaching staff was excited about. But then he had a fumble in the second half of the game at Miami. It was a one-score game. I think it was a 7-3 game midway through the either 10-3 or 7-3 midway through the third quarter. UVA's going in to get on the board, and Hollins he had a couple of nice runs too prior to the fumble, but he gave the ball away, and Miami kind of pulled away from there, and that kind of the leash was short with the freshman. And then when you fumble in a spot like that, he didn't get a whole lot of opportunities from that point moving forward. He played a little bit against Liberty late in the season, but then he opted out last year. And by all accounts, he's a guy who has come back and has looked pretty good in this preseason. I would think he is maybe the biggest threat at this point to Talapapa at the top of that depth chart. They're running 5 deep at running back, but the question is, how many opportunities are some of these guys going to get? You had mentioned Ronnie Walker earlier. He played a little bit once the waiver was granted late in the season last year. So we'll see if now full season in this program coming from Indiana, what he can offer. Devin Darrington is a grad transfer from Harvard who, again, put up a lot of yards at Harvard, but wasn't necessarily a game breaker there. So we'll see what he can offer. And then Ahmad Boston is a true freshman who's been here since the spring. He enrolled early. I know they like him a lot catching passes out of the backfield, but I don't know. It's tough for a first year to get on the field in that backfield unless he's really offering something special. This coaching staff puts so much value on the work that guys put in practice. And Talapapa has just always been one of those guys who works really hard in practice. And that leaves an impression on this coaching staff. So I still think he's the guy to beat out for the job. I think Hollins may be the best option to potentially break a big run and become more of that game breaker, and which is something, as I mentioned, that this offense needs. But running back is definitely one of those spots that you point to and say, all right, let's see what they have once these games get going and how they're able to utilize these guys and what these different guys offer and what it looks like as these games get going. Because I think, as of right now, a week and a half or so from opening day, it's fair to call it a question mark, and we'll see what it kind of turns into as the season unfolds.
Moving to pass catcher, obviously, this is probably where they lost the most production from last year, including with an injury. Earl Davis tears the ACL, and then obviously Tony Poljan and Terrell Jana leave the program as seniors. So Billy Kemp, the most production coming back, the Richmond, Virginia Highland Springs product. Just have to mention that because that's my hometown product coming back. Obviously, Ketan Thompson, which people have compared to Taysom Hill, who played at BYU under Coach Mendenhall, and then obviously the transfer from Oklahoma State. Jelani Woods are probably three names to watch. How do you feel about the pass catching unit? And obviously, I think it's the unit that has to step up the most heading into this season.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how they utilize a lot of these guys. A lot of the talk coming out of camp this year has just been about how they're trying to come up with creative ways to get different guys involved in the offense in a number of ways. You mentioned Ketan Thompson. I think that all starts with him. We saw a lot of that last year coming in as a quarterback, but then he has the shoulder injury and he turns into this sort of jack of all trades, running the ball as a receiver. He didn't throw it a whole lot last year, but that shoulder is healthy now. So it'll be interesting to see if they add that little wrinkle to it. Jelani Woods at tight end is such a big target at 6'7", 270. But he's athletic too. They're really excited about the way he looked in the weight room and in conditioning. And he's another former quarterback. I asked him this morning, we got him after practice, and I asked him, will we see you throwing the ball at all this year? Because we're hearing so much about how creative they're getting. He just kind of smiled and said, you'll have to wait and see. So we'll see if that's a wrinkle that they add to this offense. Dantavion Wix is a guy who they had high hopes for him 2 years ago as a true freshman. He played a little bit, made a nice play late in the Liberty win 2 years ago as a true freshman, a nice touchdown catch from Brennan Armstrong. He missed all of last year with a foot injury, but he's healthy now. And he's a guy who, by all accounts, what we've seen on social media, the highlights that we get to see, he's made some plays down the field in this passing game. So there are enough. Billy Kemp, you mentioned Billy Kemp. I can't forget about Billy Kemp. They love his hands. He's just very reliable. You throw him the ball and he's going to make the catch. And we'll see if maybe he breaks a couple more of those for big games this year. He didn't have, I think he had one touchdown catch last year. So maybe you hope to see more production from him in terms of putting points on the board, but he's very reliable in those third downs. Get past the chains and you can count on him to make the catch. So I think there's a variety of guys who maybe are a little unproven or a chance to become even bigger options in this option. It's just in this offense. I mean, it's just a matter of who steps up and becomes those reliable options, especially on third downs or in the red zone. I think Jelani Woods is going to be such a key part of a lot of that stuff. And then we'll see how it kind of unfolds from there.
Moving on to their defense, which was a unit that sort of struggled last season, didn't set you could expect a very solid unit from the Cavalier defense. Obviously giving up 493 yards per game and 30 points per game is not ideal from a defense. Granted, they played some really good teams last year and had some good moments throughout the season. What are your overall expectations for this defense? Obviously, they're losing some production, but they're also returning a lot.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. This is another one of those things that they're not really talking about right now, but the hints are there that there may be some scheme changes coming defensively. I know with the direction the whole sport of football, especially at the college level, has gone in recent years, we see so many sub packages with additional defensive backs on the field most of the time anyway. But I don't know how often we'll see. Traditionally, since Bronco has been here, they've been a base 3-4 defense with sub packages coming off of that. I don't know how much we'll see that base 3-4 this year. I think we're going to see a lot of maybe a 3-3-5 or maybe 2-4-5 or maybe even a 2-3-6 getting those addition, because the depth is in the defensive backfield on this team this year. They brought in a couple of grad transfer cornerbacks who they're excited about, and those guys are pushing for playing time right away. Anthony Johnson from Louisville, Hayes from
North Dakota State.
Yeah, Josh Hayes from North Dakota State, who's a little dinged up right now, but they think is going to be back in time for the opener against William and Mary. And they've got a lot of those super seniors, those guys back for fifth and even sixth years. Devontae Cross at safety, Nick Grant at corner. Those guys are in their sixth year in this program now. Joey Blunt, another veteran safety, is in his fifth year in this program, and he's played all 4 years. He's back because of that COVID year. So, and they're deeper up front too. Mandy Alonso is another one of those fifth-year guys who's a so-called super senior. And Aaron Famui played a lot, especially in 2019 as a sophomore, and was really disruptive up front as a sophomore late in the year. He opted out last year, but he's back this year now too. So yeah, I just think And like you talked about at the top, they know they didn't have the kind of season. This is a program that was built on having a strong pass defense. If you go back and you look at 18 and 19, the most successful seasons under Bronco, they were like fourth in the ACC both of those years in pass defense, and the bottom kind of fell out. They gave up 300 some yards passing last year, and I think that's what's leading to some of these potential scheme changes. And then the other spot you got to mention is linebacker. They're deep. They may not be as deep at linebacker as they had been, but Nick Jackson is a really good linebacker. Noah Taylor's a guy who's played a lot of football, and he's a guy who I always point to. I think he's poised going into his final year. He looks bigger. He just seems like he's more locked in. He's always been a guy who seemed to be locked in, but even some of his teammates have said that that's gone to another level. I think he's poised to have a big year rushing the passer from an outside linebacker spot. But Elliott Brown's the other guy who's he's been in this program a long time, a fifth-year guy at outside linebacker who I think he's been behind guys like Zane Zandier and others these last few years. And this is his opportunity to make a mark going into his final year. So they know, like you talked about, that last year, especially from a pass defense perspective, was not what the standard has been for this program and for this defense. And I think they've kind of, whether it's scheme changes, personnel changes, getting other guys on the field, bringing in those grad transfers, as I talked about, they've tried a variety of different ways to improve that. And now we'll see how that looks as we get going here. I don't even know how much they'll show against William and Mary, and maybe not even Illinois. They may be hiding some of this stuff with that game in Chapel Hill, the North Carolina game in week 3. They may try to keep some stuff under wraps these first few weeks and then kind of drop some stuff on North Carolina, because obviously we know how significant that game is in the bigger picture for the Coastal.
Obviously, when you look at this defense, you have to look at the hole that Charles Snowden and Zane Zandier. It's a pretty big hole. I know you touched on the linebacking core, but those two were really, the stalwarts, the leaders of this defense last season, and they were really good against the run. It was the pass game that really hurt them last season. How do you expect UVA to step up, not just from, the linebacking core, which you touched on, but from a leadership point of view? Do you see a guy like Joey Blunt being kind of that voice on the defense, given his experience and, probably being the best player on that defensive side?
Yeah, I think Blunt is an obvious guy when you start talking about leadership from the defensive standpoint. But a few other guys, there's been a lot of talk this preseason about a few other guys who've been on the field for a few years, maybe the coaching staff nudging them into becoming more vocal leaders on the field. Mandy Alonso on the defensive line has always been a guy who has led by example. He's the guy who broke the rock, for instance, getting singled out for the work he put in this offseason, the conditioning work. He was the first one, another one of those UVA traditions. He was the first one to get the choice of jersey number selection. So he's always been a guy who led by example by putting in the work, but he's a guy who I think is being relied on to be more of a vocal leader on the defensive line. And then I talked about Nick Jackson and Noah Taylor at linebacker, but I think those are two other ones who Kelly Papinga, the outside, the linebackers coach now, he talked a lot early in preseason about how Nick Jackson, especially, maybe not the most vocal guy, but he's going to need to be now. He's a veteran on that defense. He's kind of that Micah Kaiser, that next generation Micah Kaiser at that inside linebacker spot. He had all the tackles last year. Kaiser was such a vocal leader in that locker room and on that defense. I think that's kind of the next step in the evolution for Nick Jackson, is becoming more of that outspoken leadership, get guys lined up. I know he and Noah Taylor, they've talked about how they compete for who can get the defense lined up fastest and things like that, making the reads and get the pre-snap, getting ready. And so I think if you're talking about leadership, the other thing you have to keep in mind is, like I touched on, there's so many guys back who've been on this defense for a long time now. I think basically everybody's expected to be more of a leader this year because there's just so much experience back.
Yeah, I think you touched on it perfectly, kind of summed up the defense. And doing my research, I wanted to touch on special teams because I think it's, the third fastest game, very important. And something that they do not have back is any specialists, which is kind of an underrated thing to look out for. Nobody really thinks about that. And that could have a big effect on the team, replacing a kicker and a punter. Obviously, Billy Kemp, primary punt returner, kick returner coming back. But have you seen anything from the specialist, and what are your expectations? I know this is, the guys off the side on the practice field, but they don't get the most focus. But this could be, a key for this team, with the field position battle in the kicking game, replacing both a kicker and a punter.
Now these guys, it's funny you put it that way, because the 3 open practices that the media has been able to watch, we've gotten 30 minutes, the first 30 minutes of 3 different practices, and most of those 90 full minutes have been special teams. So they haven't been off to the side. They've been front and center for when we've been able to watch. And so we've gotten to see a lot of the kickers. Justin Dunkel has consistently been the number 1 kicker, both for field goal and extra point, and kickoff specialist as well. So he's been the number 1 guy there. I know I don't think we've seen him miss a field goal in the practices we've been there for. Pearson has been the number 2 kicker. I don't know if he's missed any either. So, I mean, I don't know. It's one thing to be making these extra points and field goals in practice, and another thing in front of fans when the games are on the line. So we'll see how that goes. But by all accounts, Dunkel has remained, and what we've seen as well, Dunkel's remained the number 1 guy in those roles. And then we got to see a little bit of punting the last open practice last Friday. And Finn, the graduate transfer from Florida, has been the number 1 punter. He was pretty good at Florida. So they seem Bronco admitted they didn't know what they were getting in him the first practice, because Bronco just hadn't seen him. He got here over the summer and they didn't do any punting that first practice. But since then, Finn seems to have solidified himself in that number 1 punter role going into the season. And then you mentioned Billy Kemp's the number 1 punt returner. Kick returner's wide open. Bronco had said the kick returner's wide open. They have like 6 or 7 guys back there competing for that spot. I don't know if maybe Dantavion Wix is a potential guy in that spot, or if they don't want to risk him on special teams because he may mean so much offensively at one of those outside receiver spots. So kick returner seems to be wide open. Ronnie Walker was back there. Damon Darrington was back there. Demick Starling, a 2nd-year receiver, was back there when we got to see some stuff. Yeah, there's a long list of guys who are kind of in contention for that role. And we may not know the answer. At this point, we probably won't know the answer to that one until they kick off against William & Mary.
Now looking at the schedule, obviously open the season with 2 non-conference games, William & Mary and Illinois. William & Mary seems to be a good opening game with an in-state opponent, but on the FCS side, and then obviously Illinois, new coach this year. We don't know what to see. Luckily, they're playing, as we record this, week 0 against Nebraska, so they'll have an idea of what they look like. They do return a lot, so that would be interesting. Obviously, big game the first half of the season at North Carolina against a very good quarterback, a team UVA was able to beat last year, so I know Carolina's going to be very motivated for that game. Vegas has the total at 6 wins, I think, with the non-conference, William & Mary, Illinois, BYU, Notre Dame. They should be able to win, or at least 3 of the 4 of those. BYU is a big question mark. That should be a very interesting game, heading to at BYU for Bronco and that coaching staff, obviously, with all the connections they have there. But replacing the number 2 overall pick could be a big issue. So what do you expect from this team in terms of a record? I don't know if you've thought about it, but 6 wins right now is the total. I am leaning towards, I think they actually get 7 this year, but it just depends on how they play, and I think it starts with the turnovers.
Yeah, I think 6, 7, somewhere in that range. There are a lot of toss. I mean, we talked about it at the top. The Coastal Division is so much unpredictability from year to year. It's really, I think the fact that they have to go to Chapel Hill, they have to go to Miami. As we said at the start, those going into the season are probably the 2 teams at the top of the pecking order. So having to visit both of those teams, especially pretty much right out of the chute at the beginning of ACC play, there's a home game against Wake Forest, and Wake Forest is a good team too. I think Clawson's a great coach too. UVA has not had a lot of success. They've played him twice since Bronco's been here and lost both of those games. So I don't know. I think there's some swing games in there, like going to Louisville. What does Louisville look like this year? That's one of those games that one of those swing games that if you're going to get to 6, 7, 8 wins, you got to win that one. They've had a lot of success. They're still unbeaten against Duke since Bronco has been here. They've only lost once against Carolina since Bronco has been here. So they've had success against Carolina, but that's a really good Carolina team. So like you mentioned the BYU game going out there, that's another one of those potential swing games. If you're going to get to 7 or 8, that's another one that I think you have to win, because especially late in the season with Tech coming here, going to Pitt, the Notre Dame game, Notre Dame coming here, that's another one that's I don't know. You got to steal one of those maybe. Going to Pitt has always been a challenge for them. They did win there the last time they went up there in 2019. They opened the season at Pitt and won that game, and that kind of springboarded them into that Coastal Division championship team. So I don't know. It's definitely not an easy schedule. I think I like Bielema. I think Bielema's a good coach. That's a good hire at Illinois. I think it helps that they're getting him early in his first year. Maybe 2-3 years from now, that would be a much more challenging game, especially them coming here too. So that's one of those games that if you're going to get to 7 or 8 wins, you need to win. William and Mary, I think those are too good. Let's get our feet get our feet under us, identify what we need to work on. Those are 2 good opportunities to do that going into that game in Chapel Hill. So yeah, it's not an easy schedule. There are definitely some challenges there and some swing games there that you're going to have to maybe steal on the road, particularly if you're going to get to 7 wins. But I think they can do it. It's just a matter of which games they're able to steal, and then just a holding court, taking care of your business at home, especially with those 2 tough ones at the end of the schedule with Notre Dame and Tech coming here to end the year. So it'll be interesting. They have their work cut out for them if they want to get 7 or 8 wins.
Well, David, that does it. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I want to appreciate you taking some time out of your day to talk to me about previewing the Cavaliers this upcoming football season. Might be talking to you next week as we get ready for William and Mary. I want to thank you so much for joining me. And how can Fastlane listeners on this special edition get in contact, or not say contact, but hear more from you at CavsCorner.com?
Yeah, CavsCorner.com. We have the latest from UVA preseason camp. We have recruiting as that kind of unfolds, UVA football and basketball. Twitter at Damon Dillman, DAMON DILLMAN, updating things there as well. So yeah, hop on and follow along for the ride. It'll be an interesting fall.
Thanks everyone for listening to this special edition of the Fast Lane. We'll have more about David Cunningham from TechSideline.com previewing the Virginia Tech Hokies, and we'll also have Damian Sorlett from the News and Advance previewing the Liberty Flames coming up later today. As this comes out, it's going to come out on Friday. So thank you so much for listening to this special edition of the Fast Lane. As always, you can connect with us at Fastlane Ed Lane on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and connect with me at Trey Lyle VT. Thank you so much for listening to this special edition of the Fast Lane.